years, 42 years, just retired. So he's going to give a little history because obviously Tampico wouldn't have been started without the railroad. And then we'll have him come up, and then we're going to have some others. Anybody would like to talk after I get done reading the pamphlet there on Tampico, then we'll have some guest speakers that were kind of grew up from Tampico and everything that are going to talk. Okay, go ahead, Craig.
Can everybody hear me so I don't have to hang on to a microphone? What?
Use the mic.
Okay, the rails in the room are saying what? So I'm not the only one here. I'm going to keep up with the two B's of good speech. Be brief and be gone. So anyway, Tampico, near as we can tell, was shortly the tail end of July of 1887 is when the railroad went through. That's the laying of the steel. The crews out ahead that built the grade, built the bridges, and everything else. There was, at one time, 9,000 men employed in the advancement of the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railroad, which was the forerunner of the Great Northern. And also used 7,000 horses. I mean, this was a major, major undertaking of its day. So anyway, Tampico was first known as Siding 47. Everybody has heard the story of how these places got their names, all these towns. They all got numbers all the way to Great Falls, and then they gave a clerk, they said, okay, your job is, you gotta name these places. So he had a globe. Spun the globe, put his finger down, and where it hit, that's where you got. That's why you have Toledo, and Zurich, and Malta, and Glasgow, and Kintyre, and all these places like that. This guy just told to do it, so he just used the map and started putting his finger down. So anyway, Tampico, Jim Hill must have really liked the valley, because of what he did is he built a demonstration farm to show prospective landowners and homesteaders that this was indeed productive land. In fact, the Tampico operation for Page Whittam, the barn was built by Jim Hill in this farming group. So that is quite an investment. A lot of people, including my family, when they came to Montana to homestead, they rode in immigrant cars. Now, I don't have a record of how many people rode an immigrant car to Tampico, but I'm sure there were some that came with that. The immigrant car was a boxcar. They paid a little or no freight for it, and they stuffed it with everything they owned. So that's part of it. At one time, Tampico had a telegrapher on duty 24 hours a day. He's the one that typed out the little tissue instructions called train orders for trains. And then when the train went by, he'd go out with a stick with a Y and it'd hold it up like this. The train went by, and the engineer or the conductor or whoever stuck their arm out the window and grabbed it. It's quite a trip. So anyway, at one time there was a water pumper. He pumped water, treated it, because they didn't want the water to foam in the boiler of the locomotive. They treated the water before they put it in the tank. So they had a water pumper here. Last passenger train, the skidoos, ended in the middle 1950s. Now, how many guys remember the skidoos, the older guys? The old guys, when I was a young fireman, they would talk about them. You know, if you wanted to get rid of you wanted to market your cream, just throw your cream can up on the crossing. This train would stop to get it. If you wanted to get on the train, no matter where you were, go to the tracks, wave a blanket, they'd stop, pick you up, and they'd take you out to where you wanted to go. In fact, anybody know Larry LaRock by chance? He was almost born on the skidoo. His mom was headed to the hospital in Popper, and he was almost born on the skidoo. So anyway, that's pretty much, the railroad was a part of Tampico, and it's a part of all northeastern Montana, because that's how you got your products to market, and you brought your stuff in. I mean, can you imagine if they had to freight a stove or anything like that? I mean, the railroads did it. Didn't exactly always treat the producers fair with the race, but that's for another day. So any questions before I'm done? Seeing none, Mr. Paul. See, I was brief and I was done.
Okay, so I'd like to go a little more into the inspiration of this. Our family has been, including through the Page Whittam family, the Etcharts, have been in Tampico for 100 years now. And anyway, when I was out with my dad, Mitch, and he'd always, talk about older Tampico and that, and then when I got hold of a photograph from Gary Martin, which really only covered a partial area, so I had to get together with Judy Michael, and we kind of had to fill in the whole rest of this, and it's not to scale, but it kind of gives you the idea of what's going on. So you have the town site here, and then Craig, Mr. Railroad, helped me explain to Judy Michaels how we could get the main line, and then you had your siding, 47, and then the industry line. And as you can see, so I didn't have a photograph of everything that you're seeing here. So we had to kind of create it. Craig was able to find the exact type of steam engine, and then this is that skidoo train that was coming through daily from Havre through Glasgow, and then there was a eastbound and westbound. And then so also on here we have obviously the Milk River and Buggy Creek, which we kind of added that on. And when you get closer and look at this, there's a lot of family farms and ranches that have changed hands over the last 100 years. And I've got some that are north of the river, and so, and then to the east, and then the southeast going back towards Glasgow, and then right east of Tampico, and Page Whittam Etchart Ranch. And we've got Seaver Anchorage Place right in the middle, and the old Tampico Bridge. And then the Porter House, which was part of our ranch, there was actually a barn there, and one of Gary Martin's nieces had a photograph that actually showed the barn there, but I didn't remember it, but it was there. And then there's also Etchart Field with a couple hangars, and I also have some of the railroad family names that were very important to the community of Tampico. So Judy, Michael, and I, this took about probably 8 months to get the painting correct, and then it took me another 8 months meeting with landowners and trying to show a history of over 100-year period, roughly, change of ownership. So anyway, and then the storyline that you see there is written in here. And obviously the Great Northern logo, Railway, the Burlington Northern, and the BNSF, and the Tampico Bridge, and then dryland farming, and then Ramblay sheep were big. I know we had a lot of them, and then Hereford was the main breed back then. Now I know things have changed. A lot of black breeders. And then I had a picture. We used to trail cattle yearlings out of Tampico, and there's cattle. We trail them from Tampico up to our North Ranch, and a lot of you guys probably participated in that cattle drive. But the last one was about 1979, and then things kind of changed. We sold the North Ranch to Kiefer, and then Page Whittam bought the Tampico and South Ranch. But anyway, so what I'd like to do is read the article a little bit. So you guys have a front and back on yours, mine 2 pages. Tampico was a water stop along the James Hill Great Northern Railroad built in the late 19th century. There was a water tank and a pumping station built to take water from the Milk River to the station for the steam locomotives. The depot section house and other houses were built for men who worked on the section crews. This often consisted of multiple generations. These railroad families were essential to the town's growth by working well with local farmers, ranchers, and local businesses. The Great Northern Railway also had a local passenger train service that was started in the early 1900s through about the 1950s, and this was called the Skidoo train. This passenger train ran from Havre, 223 eastbound, to Williston, 224 westbound. This train had an engine, 2 baggage cars, 1 freight car, and a coach at the rear of the train. This service brought mail, passengers, and goods. Most of the highway roads were graveled in this area, which made it impossible to transverse in harsh weather conditions. The enlarged Homestead Act of 1909, which increased allocated acreage for dry land homesteading from 160 to 320, created a homestead rush in 1910 to the Tampico area. Some of the original homesteaders were the Lohr family, Art and Marie Motzkow, Mary Harrington Mallarue, Nellie Erickson Martin, Al White, Maroney family, Connerton, and many more. The homesteaders came from all parts of the United States of America and all over the world. Newly arrived immigrants from Europe arrived in immigrant railroad cars that helped settle the land around Tampico. The town site of Tampico was growing. The original post office was at the Lohr farm, and around 1910 was moved into Art and Marie Motzkow's general store, which operated until 1957. The post office continued to operate until 1973. Around 1911, T.G. Dahl also built a general store, and M.T. Matson started a lumber yard and a hardware store around the same time. The Tampico Steel Truss Bridge was built in 1911, connecting lands to the west and north of the Milk River, which also helped local commerce and transportation over for 90 years until it was replaced in the earliest 21st century. Tampico School was built in 1912 by Dick Hilt and the Upsall brothers to accommodate local school children. Tampico School was a one-room schoolhouse that went through 8th grade. In the early 40s, the Billingsley School was added on to the Tampico School. This required 2 teachers to accommodate for the population growth. A lot of the teachers stayed with local farms and ranches. The Tampico School operated until 1977. Richard Motzkow built a small garage in 1917, which eventually was destroyed by a fire. In 1926, he built a larger garage and hardware store, which he operated until 1977. Motzkow was an operator for the railroad, ran the Great Northern Trading Plant, carried the mail to and from the railroad depot, and had farming interests until 1977. As Tampico grew, a community hall was built in 1917 to accommodate local gatherings. In fact, in addition to the community hall, Tampico at one point in time had a country store, grain elevator, post office, railroad depot, stockyards, garage, lumber and supply store, blacksmith shop, and a sugar beet dump near the rail yard. By the late 1930s, there was a grass landing strip at Etchart Field for small airplanes near Tampico. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation Milk River Irrigation Project brought many workers to build the Vandalia Diversion Dam in 1917. A lot of construction, canals, leveling of land, building ditches for irrigation purposes. The Vandalia Canal diverts water to be used southeast of Vandalia for Tampico, Glasgow, and all the way to Nashua, Glasgow Water District. This irrigation project produced more fertile lands that grew higher quality crops like sugar beets, corn, alfalfa, hay, and grains. In the fall around Tampico, crops would be harvested for transport. Sugar beets would be loaded and shipped off to Chinook, Montana. Grain crops were hauled and weighed and unloaded at the grain elevator for storage to be later hauled by rail. The Great Northern Railway shipped wool during shearing operations in the fall. The stockyards were busy with sheep and cattle, which were trailed by ranchers, loaded and shipped to the Midwest on rail cars. Then there was a kind of a Tampico slowing down era. Things changed when the main road, US Highway 2, got moved further to the north and fewer people passed through Tampico. But that didn't stop Tampico from being special. For those in Valley County, this place holds memories of a strong community spirit. Even now, when you're in Tampico, you can feel the heart and soul of its history. Therefore, maintaining cultural significance to the county. Most of old Tampico is gone, besides a few remaining buildings owned by Rick Malvik. This Tampico project is to honor all of the past Tampico members. The Tampico project includes a composite of land ownership for the last 100 years or so. In 2023, the artwork on this was done by Judy Michael. Paul Etchart helped with the concept and design of the Tampico painting, Tampico article, and compilation of land ownership. Paul would like to thank Rick and Allison Malvik, Ken Malvik, Seaver and Kim Ankrud, and Paula, I see you here, Lee Cornwell, Bud Cornwell, Gary Martin family, Matt Page, Stephen Michelle Page, Don Nelson, Sonny Floyd Nelson, Gina Nelson Riley in there, Jack Billingsley and Jay, Barry Billingsley, Sid Rice, Pat Rice, Ben Borson, Dick Cotton, Doris Ozark, Dorothy Ayers, Paula Tishmak, Saladowitz, I'm sure if I spelled it right, Robbie Youngkin, Norm Broughton, James Kirkland, Donnie Ellison, Donnie Jones, Scott Castle, Scott Fossum, Bruce Riggin, Tim Potter, and any of the other Potter family, Bob and some of them, and Steve Sukat, Billy Uphouse, Craig Gilchrist, Bob Myers, Mike Daly, Wes Scott, Joe Etchart, which him and I went flying so we could get a better perspective of Tampico from the air. And my son Ethan Etchart, Emily Etchart, Evan Etchart, and Barry Chalmers is the one who helped do all the digital work on here. So thank you to all the people that contributed to this project. So we'll have Seaver, would you like to talk right now? And then we'll have like Gary Martin and a few others. You get through to here maybe?
I moved this.
Oh, okay. If you'd like to, okay, go ahead.
I'm an original person, probably the oldest living member of the Tampico family. And I was born in 1931, and I lived my whole life in Tampico. And then I moved into Prairie Ridge, and there's quite a story about Tampico. I can remember I used to deliver milk there, and there were 3 operators that worked for the Great Northern, and there was 2 houses, one for the section foreman and one for the laborers. And it was a great time. You know, we enjoyed everybody, and everybody played cards, and the Tampico Hall was built. We had some beautiful dances there, and well, I could go on, but I won't. If there's anybody who's got any questions, I can answer.
When they run the wild horses in their receiver, did you get any quotes?
Yeah.
Cause they didn't ship them quotes
Well,
on the car?
Al White
Yeah.
and Jack Billingsley, well, Billingsley,
Jim.
and Jim Billingsley, and Al White, and Anderson from out south. They brought a bunch of wild horses into Glasgow, and that's where I got my first colt. They brought, oh, I don't know how many carloads, but that was the roundup for the wild horses. And they wanted to water them there at the irrigation ditch. So they said, you just pick out a colt if you want to break it. And there weren't nothing, you know, so we got our share of horses.
Good.
Yeah, I knew you did.
Well, thank you, Seaver. One of the people we're missing, I wanted to acknowledge Jack Billingsley helped with a lot, and I know he's down south, and we'll have Jay talking a little bit here. But I'd like to start with maybe Gary Martin.
What do you want me to say?
Okay. Try not to chew me out too much.
Okay.
But Gary's also
I'm not a
been,
public speaker, but I can talk. Basically, it's born and raised in Glasgow. Lived in Tampico. My grandmother was on the railroad, married to a railroad man. He was killed, she came out here about 1900. And then things went from there. The Lohr brothers were at Tampico before they filed a homestead, and they filed in 1901, and they asked my grandmother, to go back to Wisconsin, where Moscow, which was sister to the Moscows. That's how they all got Moscow. And then they come out in 1910 to set up the store and keep working for Moscow. Anyway, we went through my grandmother filed a homestead in 1906. Her brother filed in 1907. And other people come in big time at about 1910 when they increased the acreage. So, anyway, spent a lot of time out there, still there. Any questions? Got a question?
Yeah, tell us a little bit about Richard Moscow. You probably remember him better than I do.
Richard was quite a character when he was younger. You need to read the Footprints of the Valley about Richard Moscow. It's he was a bachelor. He spent all his time down at that store down there when the rest of the family went away. I used to go down there after dark. He had a German Shepherd named Loki. He guarded Richard pretty good. I got along with the dog pretty good. But anyway, I have a lot of relatives that started in Tampico, Glasgow, went from there. That work for you? That work?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Okay. And once he talked about flying down there, the Etchart strip was there for years. And of course, I've stayed in aviation all my life. And I got started at Etcharts and Marcos and things like that. One guy I remember is, yeah, okay.
Think of it, let us
Okay,
know.
yeah.
Thank you. So, Jane, would you like to come up and talk a little bit? Jack? Trying to make a cheat sheet. Why don't you come up to the and then right over here. See you.
So the Billingsley family, 1907 is our official establishment date out in the Tampico area. Three brothers came out, homesteaded.
Talk into the mic.
They originally, we were sheep herders, is what they tell me. So that's kind of what brought us brought them out, and they came from Iowa. Wish my dad was here. I say I'm the young guy here, but I am over 50 years old now, and I should be learning a lot of this verbal history. I'm sure a lot of you in here could give me a lot of lessons on the Tampico Valley and then my family as well. But I jotted down just a couple little notes here. I'm the 4th generation, and my 3 girls are the 5th generation on our ranch. Been through a lot of roller coasters over the years. They made it through the 30s and made it through the 80s, and I guess I can say we made it through the last 3 years. So that felt like the 30s, all the stories from the 30s to me. My grandmother, probably most everybody knows Dorothy, our grandmother. Dorothy. She taught school at the Billingsley School, and I don't know a lot of the history of why it was named the Billingsley School. I just know that's how it came to be, and I don't know exactly how long she taught at Tampico. I know she taught my dad, and I've heard a few stories about that. And the Tampico school closed up a year before I went to school, so I didn't get to experience the school there. My brother, Scott, who's 5 years older than me, spent a couple years there going to school. And then once that school closed down, then Grandma Dot, that's what I called her, some of you might have known her as that, but she came to Glasgow and finished out her teaching career in town. There's 2 really fond memories that come to mind right now about visiting Tampico when I was a little guy. The first one was going to Ernie Martin's garage. And I didn't care about picking up parts or anything, but when I went there, I'd always try and catch a ride if somebody was going to Tampico for parts. Because Ernie always had 2 or 3 guns behind the counter. And that was the reason I went to Tampico to the store, is just to marvel at the 22 guns.
He actually sold rifles and stuff there.
Yeah,
He wasn't just behind the counter.
well, that's what I remember is guns, and a box of 22 shells. And I eventually got a gun from Ernie Martin's store. Still have it to this day. And then the other one is Agnes. That, to me, I mean, whenever my mom or grandma would go get eggs, I would make sure I went, because those of you that'll remember, up on top of her cupboards were boxes and boxes of cookies and treats. That was the main reason I went for the treat. An hour later, I was full of treats, and away we'd go to home. So those are just a couple real fond memories that I have.
That was Agnes Mulvey?
Yep, Agnes Mulvey. Yeah. I have heard a lot of stories about riding horseback from our place to Tampico, and people coming from the South Country would stop at our place for the night and then go on to Tampico. And I've heard lots of wild dance stories, and it was a pretty happening little place back in the time. But unfortunately, I missed out on the good old days there. So that's about all I can.
Oh, okay.
I have.
Well, thank you, Jay. Dorothy, Dorothy Dolson, Gary? She's been kind of in all parts of Valley County, so maybe turn around here so they can see you.
Yeah, I was born up at the Canadian line, ended up out at Farnock on a ranch for many years, and now I'm in the middle. So I guess I've been everywhere, so to say. But my connection to the Tampico area is my grandpa, Walt Dawson, who was born in Minnesota. Traveling around the country, met a girl in Iowa, Laura Chenoweth, married and stayed there for a few years and went to, had 2 little girls, and 5 years later had a boy in Omaha, Nebraska. Grandpa had come to Glacier Park working in a mine where his brother was. And his brother Joe ended up out towards Tampico. I don't know exactly where his homestead was. Could look it up, I guess. And Grandpa didn't do very well in the mine as he had lost his left hand. He only was one-handed all his life, well, from 20 years on, something like that. And so Joe Dawson, his brother, moved somewhere west of Glasgow on the river and homesteaded. So Grandpa thought that'd be a good idea. And so he came in 1902 to what is now the Financer place. Everybody else knows who owns it now probably, but I don't. And anyway, they lived there till 1911, but Grandpa raised draft horses. A lot of them, well, he got 160 acres. I see by Paul's paper, you got another 160 in 1909. So I don't know if he did or not. But anyway, he bought some draft horses out of, I believe, southern Canada. And of course, on 160 acres, you're not going to graze much of anything very long. So they weren't any fences, they just turned them loose. And a bunch of mares, because he was going to raise draft horses. Anyway, the horses pulled out. Well, you know, a horse always goes back home. And so they went up the Canadian line. Grandpa didn't worry about them until spring. And they were all wintered out on the grass up there, and he went up the Canadian line and thought, "Ooh, what wonderful country." And so he located up there. He bought somebody's, bought out a homestead that somebody didn't prove up on. But he did prove up on his place on Milk River. Grandma would go up with the kids in the summertime. By then they had 6 kids. And back for school, buggy cook school, or I'm not exactly sure what it was. But anyway, the kids went to school there till 1911, and Grandma, I think it was wash day, had a fire and burned the house down. So Dad was a 12-year-old then, and saddled up the team and headed up north where Grandpa was, and 2-day trip, I think. And that's my connection with Tampico area, which wasn't really Tampico, but it was west of Glasgow on the river, Milk River. So,
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Also, Rick Mulvig or Donnie Nelson. I know Bertha Nelson, I was hoping Robbie Yonkin would come. She was going to maybe talk a little bit about 4-H and, you know, Bertha Nelson's very big involvement in the 4-H program, and doesn't look like she was able to make it. But if anybody would like to, that has a little more story about that, Gina, if you would like to say anything about your grandmother and Paula? Sure, okay. So, Paula Inkru.
I don't know if my sisters want this recorded or not, but I'm going to do it. And so first of all, the question about Richard Motzkow, I remember as a little kid being kind of scared of him, but he always talked to us when we went and got the mail. And there's no way we were going to not go get the mail, because you never knew who you were going to run into. And then also he got, for Halloween, we always made sure we went trick-or-treating there. because he gave us the big candy bars. Each one got one big candy bar. And then, of course, Dorothy Morton, she always made homemade popcorn balls. So I remember one year as a sixth grader going to Glasgow, and yeah, you got a lot of different candy and stuff, but it was nothing like the good homemade and the big candy bars from Richard Motzkow. 4-H, oh boy. Okay, so 4-H, Tampico Boys, and somebody told me once there was a Tampico Girls 4-H club too?
Gina would probably know.
Okay, yeah, so then they combined, help me out here, okay? So, anyway, I don't even know when they started. I just remember. Back in the 30s, okay. You sure you don't want to come up here? We can do an interview type of thing? Okay. Yeah, Bertha and Agnes were great 4-H leaders. Bertha had the patience of Job, was kind-hearted, soft. I don't think I've ever seen Bertha get mad, not ever. She was there to help you do whatever, and so was Agnes. Agnes probably was a little bit more stout than Bertha, but yeah, I mean, I just remember Bertha having a very soft voice. Okay, let's do whatever needs to be done. I remember her going and helping with. I think we did some sewing things and then cooking and going to her house and, working on the record book or doing whatever we needed to do to, get things going there. And also Agnes, she was always reminding us and telling us about things that needed to be done besides Mom. And so yeah, I don't know. I think they were the first ones to break the ceiling, whatever they do. I don't know if there's ever been, and I'm sorry, you guys. They were the best. They were the best, yeah. And just knew everything. If you had a question, you called them up, and they knew the answer, and whatever. And I don't know if they ever missed a meeting. They were both there all the time and stuff. And they were there at the fair and afterwards, and I remember having times when we needed to work to get record books done. I remember being, I guess this is something I will say. I was the first woman president of the Tampico Boys 4-H Club. And so I remember, we should put that somewhere. But anyway, and I remember, just Bertha helping every step what needed to be done. I remember Agnes, if you didn't stand up to say the pledge and the 4-H creed or whatever it is, she would tell us to stand up, and things like that. And both of them were there to help you as you went through that office or any of those offices, the secretary, vice president, the treasurer, all of it. So I think that was just their gift, and they gave, and they've had a lot of kids. One thing anything else about 4-H, because we can ask questions.
Go ahead and say their names again first.
Who's that?
Well, Bertha is the full.
Oh, Bertha Nelson, Bertha Kirkland. They were both Kirkland, right? Stensland. Okay, yeah, Bertha Stensland. And Agnes.
Gladys Fletcher.
Yeah, Gladys, was she a leader? Yeah, that was a sister, yeah. Anyway. Oh, Stensland, okay, yeah, see, I couldn't forget. Okay, so I think, when I think of Tampico, one thing that sticks out in my mind as really the icon of Tampico is the Tampico Bridge. Because, of course, we live right on it. Yeah, you didn't know that, did you, Dad? Anyways, because, we live right there. And, when I was little, I always thought, the Milk River was named because of where we lived and the milk, and we were like a part of the teacup. But, and I knew Vandalia had a bridge and there were other ones, but there was no bridge like the Tampico Bridge. And I remember when they took it down, that was really hard for me. And I even told Dad, I said, you know what, I think life started going to hell when they took our Tampico Bridge. Because that bridge has a lot of history. You can kind of tell the seasons by it. Probably in the wintertime, it was probably the slowest, but also the Tampico Bridge, I mean, we know the hall and the school and the Martin Repair or Moscow and the post office were social places, but so was the Tampico Bridge. Because more often than not, a lot of times you met people going, you know, one or the other had to back up. And it always seemed that the people always stopped and had to visit for a while, you know, when they got across the side and met the other person. So there was a lot of socializing going on either side of the bridge. Another thing is, in the summer, you know, people were haying, so you saw a lot of equipment go back and forth. And then when it got time to chop corn, you would see corn rolls trucks and Etcharts and stuff. So, I mean, it got really busy. And then in the fall, I remember Donnie Jones, I don't know how many years he moved cows, and then also, or his cattle back to his place from the north side of the river. And and it was always fun to see, you know, how they were going to get across the bridge. I remember Dad going out there and putting some hay down to get them started. And also, we used to have those big fence with the big 2x8 planks and stuff, and wondering if there's going to be a disaster. And then also sometimes wondering if the bridge is going to stand, all those going over, running over. So a lot of good memories there. And I remember Martin Repair, Jay, a story I have what I look forward to when going to Ernie's to see him and stuff is he used to have a case of knives, jackknives and stuff. So I remember as a little kid going and looking at those when I would go with Dad and stuff. And I remember once, I don't know, Ava or it probably was Ava, I think. We went up there, and so I decided I would get myself one. So I got a white one, it's with the white stone, and I told Ernie to charge it. Needless to say, thanks, Dad.
Thank you, Doris Ozark showed up. Doris, her family, come on, Doris, get up here. A little bit about Doris's Schneider and that. All right, here we go. Mr. Tampico.
Well, I was the 8th Mulvig kid, and all 8 of us graduated from Tampico Tech. I have a little story about Mitch Etchart. He said when he went to Glasgow, the first guy he met was Owie Markle. Owie Markle asked him, "Where are you from?" He said, "Tampico." He said, "Oh, you're at Tampico Tech." So every time I saw Mitch after that, he said, "We're Tampico Techs." I got a Montana Tech.
Oh.
That's as close as I could come to it. Tampico Tech.
Get one made up.
But it was a great place to live. Still live there, so that's about all I got.
Oh, that's great. So I see Tim Potter. Tim, could you come up and talk a little about the Potter family? And I know the Potter family have their place across the river, but they also, a lot of the Potter family worked for my dad and that, and they were very important to the Tampico area. But if you'd like to come up and say anything, Tim?
I don't know if I.
A little bit, maybe talk about your folks and a little bit.
My dad, Harold, worked for Etchart for a long time. I worked at home for a lot of years back in the late 60s and early 70s. I can tell you a story about Richard Moscow. One time I went up to get some parts, and Richard couldn't find what I needed, so we had to go find Ernie, and he was out in the field somewhere. So we jumped in his, I think he had that pink and black car of his. We tore off down the Tampico Road, doing about 90 miles an hour. looking for Ernie. That was that's when I was working for Etchart out there. My grandparents homesteaded up off the Porcupine over there in 1916, and it was in the 20s that they moved down to the river and started farming and stuff down there. Bob probably knows a little more about that too. Because Fred and Jenny moved down there and homesteaded, started farming. Then my dad took over the place and worked for your dad, Mitch and Mark, over across the river for a long time with Melford. Melford was there when I worked over there. So I started with Oscar Lighthizer across the river at the Cancer unit, working for you guys. So that's a little bit about what went on up there. So here, Bob.
Yeah, go ahead. I wanted to say, Melvin Murata was, just passed away, I don't know if you guys knew, but, he had worked at Etchart Ranch for 20-some years, and then Hinsdale Livestock, and he was very important to our family, and, we really miss him. But Bob, would you like to say a little bit, Bob Potter?
Well, Tampico was kind of a special place because, like everybody else, every time I went to Tampico, I had to stop and visit Ernie Martin. He was, I don't know, a mechanical genius, you might say. If he couldn't have it in the parts house, he would make it. And he was very good at it. And we talk about Bertha Nelson and the Nelson family. I spent some time with Floyd and Sonny and Donnie and going to see Bertha, and let me tell you what, that was the best place to stop and get a cup of coffee and a cookie or a piece of cake or something, because you couldn't leave there unless you had a dessert and a cup of coffee. And let me tell you what, it was a really special place to go, for me anyway, because I knew I was always going to get a treat. And I didn't know Richard Moscow, but they told me he just drove like a wild man down to a Dick probably can tell you more about Ernie Martin than I can. But anyway, Tampico was a nice place to go. Really friendly people, enjoyed it, and that's about what I can say about the Nelsons and my history of Tampico is visiting Ernie Martin. You got a little story there, let me tell you, if he didn't have it, it was a miracle. Like you said. If he didn't have it, he'd make it, right, Rick?
So we still have Billy Uphouse, Dick Cotton, and Bud Cornwell. So, yep, you betcha. Turn it on.
Yeah, back to the railroad days, I think my grandparents left Danford, Illinois in 1911 or 12, $25 a car. They got as far as Church's Ferry, which is by Devil's Lake, and my dad's two older brothers and my grandpa, they worked in the wheat fields harvesting, getting money to come the rest of the way. Okay, back to Tampico. My dad, he worked up there at the beet dump, plus Paisley, when they run during the war effort. And me and my brother, we get done with chores, we'd go over and help him move the cars. I think they call it a tariff man. And every producer dumped his sugar beets in a side dump, I think, where they side dump, Stever, them trucks. And then he always had to take a little sample, just like you do with wheat, a little burlap sack, and then he put a metal band around it, had a number in the producer, and I think they tested them for sugar content when they got to Chinook. And when the cars got pulled, me and my brother would help him move them. We'd tie our cord rope on the car and one guy get on the jack, and the other would send him down the line. Didn't spot another one. And he worked at Paisley too, during the war effort. I don't know, I'm 10, 11 years old. Another story about Tampico. I think I'm about an 8th grader or a freshman. We got out of school, me and my brother and Walton Gene Haynes. We went south and we stayed at Gideon's old stone house, which is still standing on Beaver Creek. Then we went over to the Peta China camp, and the Whitmires were gathering beef, and they was 2 3-year-old steers. Bob and Howard Whitmire, and I remember Scotty Aiken working for him, and great hearts up. Gordon Brown, he rode down from his place, and his son was my age, but, and the other guy was Joe Stebley. And we helped him there 3 or 4 days, and he put that beef herd together, and then, I don't know, it was Bear Track Schultz or Luke Schultz come over with a chuck wagon, and they trailed him to Tampico. And when he got to Tampico, Moscow, Martin, and Malvig had too many white buildings. Bob Whitmire told me later that he said they had to take him to Vandalia to load him. They pretty spooky. Well, them days, them steers, them calves wintered out, so they never had much contact with human beings at horseback. But he said they kind of got skittish and stampeded on them, so they had to take them up to Vandalia. So there was too many white buildings in Tampico. Another thing, when we rode over there, you know how kids are, you never pack no water. So you drink that alkali water, and you learn to take your pants down before you take a drink. That's about all I got. Gaber, he told about the wild horses.
So, actually, before Dick and Bud, Robbie showed up to talk a little bit,
So I'm going to talk about 4-H in the Tampico community, and I've digging through records, I have found a wealth of information. The earliest records that I can find of a 4-H club in the Tampico area was 1928, and there were several clubs, and in those days they had more project clubs than they had just community clubs like we have now. And so they had the Sappy Sowers, and there was a East Tampico Club, and there was a West Tampico Club, and there was a Buggy Creek Stockman, or stock growers. That was Dad and Bill and Guy Wagner, and there was one other member in that club, I don't remember who it was. And then through the 30s and the 40s, it became more community-oriented clubs. And the history that I have learned is that there was a Tampico Boys and a Tampico Girls. But what I found, and I brought the book with me, so after this, if anybody would like to look through it, it's fascinating. It has a list of all the members in every year. It looks like 47, 48, and 49, we had Tampico Boys and Tampico Girls. And then it became Tampico Boys. And all of a sudden, girls were on the membership roster of Tampico Boys. And so I think that's kind of when we, everything consolidated into one club. Also, some more history. The charter that we have for the Tampico Boys 4-H Club is actually 1966, and I cannot find the original charter, which would have been in 1928, so that's going to be my mission to try to find that. And also in the 80s, the state 4-H office in Bozeman actually ended up going to court and defending the Tampico Boys 4-H Club because they said our name was too exclusive, and that we wouldn't, so we had to prove that we actually did let girls into the Tampico Boys 4-H Club. But this information that I brought is really fascinating, so I will set it up in the back of the room where you guys can look at it. Does anybody have any questions about that? Does everybody know what 4-H is? I'm assuming with this crowd you do. It started in Montana, it started in 1912 as the government was trying to impose new ideas, and the older people were not really that receptive to the new ideas, so they decided to teach the youth, and then the youth taught their parents, or their parents learned with. And this was both in cropping and livestock, and also food preservation, cooking, sewing, and all of those things. Jenna? Okay.
Oh, any idea who the first girl president was of the Tampico Boys
I
Club?
won't be able to tell you that with some research into this binder I have.
I think somebody here knows that already.
You were the first girl president? Wow, that's progress.
Of the 70s, so, yeah,
Wow.
that probably helped them, to extension like that.
Exactly, just like
And I'm
that,
sure,
you're probably
how many
right.
more have there been?
Girl presidents?
Yeah.
Several. So some names, if you guys are interested in names. Billingsley's were in Tampa Boys. Nelson's, Mulvigs, Colstead. There's a family named Lentz. Do you know that one, buddy? Lentz?
Lens?
Yeah, Lentz.
No, I didn't know they were around Tampico.
Yeah, there was.
What?
Yeah, there was a Lynch bud.
There might have been some Martins also in that class.
I remember there was a gal
Yeah.
named Alma or something like that.
Very interesting. And then Bertha Nelson kind of holds the record for longevity as being a leader. And while Gina was coaching me this afternoon, I was looking, and I think she began as a leader either in 46 or 47 and continued on for 50-some years. So that's pretty incredible. Yeah, Agnes wasn't as famous for that, so I'm not really sure if she started later maybe as a leader. Yeah, so there's your touch of fortune as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Robbie. Okay, Dick Cotton, and then we'll have Bud Cornwell, and then we'll open it up for anybody else too, so.
Well, I don't know a whole lot about Richard Moscow. He was an imposing character about my size, and he always wore khaki shirts and pants. And he always had a cigar. And when you went in there, he was kind of an imposing character. You kind of walked around and kept your eye on him because you knew that he was watching you. One thing that I do remember, though, I remember seeing an invoice for a tractor overhaul that Ernie Martin did in Richard's shop. And everything that was put into that tractor, down to the cotter pins that were put in the rod bolts, were listed. There were 8 cotter pins at 1 penny a piece. You didn't get anything from Richard that you didn't pay for, but you didn't pay for anything you didn't get either. And the one other thing I really remember about Richard, he had that pink and gray or dark colored 56 Mercury, and he was on the Stock Growers bank board, and he'd park it in front of the store, and he had it timed so that he would get in that Mercury and he would be at his Stock Growers meeting in like 8 minutes from Tampico. And when you saw him coming down the road, you usually pulled off on an approach or you got a busted windshield. That's what I remember about Richard.
They said he beat the skidoo to town.
Oh, he could, sure. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. He drove like the milltails of hell. But he was a great guy. But Ernie is the one that made the clock tick in that place. He was a mechanic to end none of them, and he could do anything and everything. And another thing that I learned when I started farming in that area was that instead of coming clear to Glasgow to get a little part of one kind or other, I could go to the Moscow shop and get the part, or get 5 gallons of oil or a belt or a piece of chain or whatever it was. They had it there. It was amazing the amount of stock that they kept in that place. one example that I remember, my mother-in-law had a breaker go bad in the main breaker box in her house. And I went downtown here in Glasgow and tried to get a breaker, and they weren't available. So I stopped and talked to Ernie about it. He said, you know, he said, I think I have some of those. We went out and looked, and sure as the devil he had them, so I bought a couple of them so I'd have a spare. And just a little interesting sidelight, I know that the Haynes boys were mentioned, Walt and Gene. One Halloween, Walt and Gene and I and my sister got on horseback, and we took a gallon of honey and a couple boxes of cornmeal, and we doctored up all the outdoor toilet seats in the country, clear to Tampico school. And there were some repercussions of that. An old gal who lived up the road a little ways, Paulina Stevens, went out, and of course it was cold, and sat down on that honey and cornmeal and softened up, and she had a heck of a time getting stood up again. And I guess she walked to the house with her bloomers around her knees so they wouldn't stick to her hind end. That's all I've got to say.
Your grandma told me about that story, the outhouse in honey.
What's that?
My grandma told me about all the outhouses around here.
I'm responsible.
Excuse me, Deputy.
What's that?
Ask you a question. You ever see that orange and black Mercury go by a house 100 miles an hour, and there was a cloud of dust hung in the air for 15 or 20 minutes after it went by?
Oh, sure, you couldn't even see to drive for a while. And when, you could tell that he was coming because you could hear the roar 2 miles up the road. Yeah, that's pretty
You ever
crazy.
see that old black and orange Mercury go by 100 miles an hour?
Oh, yeah. Every time he went to town, that's the way he drove. That's just the way Richard was. You probably got better stories than I have.
That was a better story than I've got. I'm not gonna use that microphone, because I was here a week ago and I didn't use it, and everybody heard me. Can you hear me?
No, we didn't.
Okay, I've been making a list here. Back to Paul mentioning the Porter House here. On this Valley County Chronicles the other day, they were telling about that area and the sugar beet production and whatnot, and they said that Mr. Porter leased this ground from the Etcharts. And then on with that time too, war times, and they had German POWs up here in the old airport, and they would go out to the beet fields to work the beet crops. And but on that Chronicles program, they said that a lot of these POWs from the Second World War weren't German. That if the Germans took over a country, they just forced those young men into their military. And so they were here, but they weren't the ones that started the war. Then back to the Etcharts, and Paul mentioned the cattle, but I can remember as a youngster when they had their sheep, and they'd summer them up here on the Porcupine at Olson Springs, and then in the fall, they'd trail them through Tampico, stop, sort the lambs off, and ship the lambs, and then trail the ewes on out south and winter them out there. And they kept the rams out there all the time, if I'm not mistaken, Paul. And,
Yeah, I think they just moved them out there in the early winter.
Yeah.
breeding.
But I can remember when they went through our summer range up there on what we'll still call Dry Run. It's now Antelope Creek, but I don't like that. And every once in a while going north, why I suppose an old ewe would lamb, and they got left up there in our pasture a couple times. And back when I was maybe this high, I could catch a ewe and a lamb on foot, and I did it. Then I had several sheep there, and I told Mark one day, I said, well, I've got some of your ewes here on the ranch. Oh, really? He said, yeah, we'll be over and get them, but he never did come and get them. So. But then you're talking about
Richard being on the bank board, and yeah, that was the way it was. He could leave Tampico and be there by the time the meeting started.
Yeah.
That actually, by the way, though, that mercury was salmon and charcoal, not pink and black. You know, and a lot of these things, if you're at all interested in this type of history, just go to the abstract office there on 2nd Avenue. They have all of these old plat books, and I found out that you go in there and with a legal description, they'll open it to that page, and they will photocopy that page for you for nothing. And it's just amazing what you can find out. Talking about Richard and his smoking, I never noticed him smoke cigars. That must have been before my time. But anyway, he smoked Camel cigarettes when I was around there a lot of the time. And I've actually seen Richard stick a toothpick in the side of his Camel cigarette butt so he could take one more puff off of it before he put it out. And talking about him keeping his books, he kept all of this like they mentioned. Each cotter pin was listed and everything. He sent out one bill a year. And he kept all of these records on a ledger sheet. And he'd be there 10, 11 o'clock at night doing this bookkeeping. He used indelible lead pencils. And now Richard was very frugal. He had a piece of copper tubing about this long that he could stick that stub of that indelible lead pencil in so he could keep using it when it got too short to hang on to write with. Then I remember also Ernie telling this, when Richard was going out of the situation, I don't remember if he had passed away or just, but anyway, they were selling stuff out of the store, and they had storage down in the basement of that building. And a fellow from Illinois drove out here with at least a half-ton pickup, maybe 3/4 ton. And he bought Model T parts that Richard had down in the basement of that building. And Ernie said, I know he was overloaded when he left here. But he had a complete frame for a Model T down in that basement. Ed Porter. Then mentioned the Whites. L. White had two brothers, George and David. George White owned the place that I'm on now back in the early 1900s, well, in the late 1800s, obviously, because he filed a water right on Dry Run for irrigation purposes on December 15th, 1895. So he was here for a while. Talking about the Skidoo, the flood of 1952, a lot of you probably remember that. They talk about 78, 79 or something being the highest flood in Glasgow. But that's because they built all those dikes out there past the stockyard and everything to hold the water back. In 1952, the river, this was in June if I'm not mistaken, Seaver, it was raining and then the Frenchman Dam washed out and here come this water. And the place we lived on, right here, the house was on a foundation and there were no field ditches or any, well, there were some field ditches, but no dikes to speak of. The water got right up to the floorboards in that house, and the floor was this high above the ground. So you couldn't get anywhere, but anyway, back to the Skidoo. That was one of the three ways you could get to Glasgow during that flood. You'd either get on the Skidoo, or have somebody fly you in, or else take a boat. Because the Tampico Highway wasn't built then, and it was covered with water, you know, I'm sure that deep. But
It washed out the bridge there, right this side of Brookdale.
what's that?
It washed the bridge out. this side of Hinsdale.
Oh, yeah,
Not the big bridge, one of the smaller
secondary
bridges
one, yeah.
that flooded 52.
See, and I remember my dad, we were still trying to farm some ground then, and we needed to get some wheat cleaned. We couldn't get to Glasgow, so we went to Vandalia with a 2-ton truck with some wheat in it, and then up over the hill, and come off that steep hill into Hinsdale to get some seed wheat cleaned. That's quite a trick going down that hill in a heavy truck. And then they're talking about Al White. He did a lot of horse work. Jim Billingsley used to tell about me. But anyway, Wes Scott was telling me here some time ago that Ed Gerspacher, who had a place out there south of Saco Malta, he and his brother came to this country, and they couldn't speak English, apparently. So they said Al White used to take the labels off of all the canned food so that they couldn't learn English by reading these cans and stuff and seeing what was in it, you know.
Gerspacher come when he was 14. His mother didn't want him to get hung up in a.
Is that right? Yeah.
And his first job was down there where the First National Bank is.
Yeah.
He was watering the horses because they had to use all slips and tumble bugs. It was all horse work. And his job was watering the teams of horses there when they dug the First National Bank.
Well, and then apparently, Wes Scott was a really good friend with Ed, and because with his trapping and whatnot. But apparently they were involved with the horses, with the canal building.
It could be, yeah.
You know, and of course that canal was all built with horses. They had elevating scrapers and wooden wheeled dump wagons, and yeah, I guess it was quite a project. Then when they took the Tampico Bridge down, it's my understanding that the company that was doing the job, you could have gotten that bridge for nothing. They would have moved it off onto the side of the river, whichever side you wanted it on, but then you had to move it to where you wanted it, you know, so consequently nobody took it and they cut it up for scrap iron. But I do have a sign that Lee brought to me some time ago. It says 1-lane bridge. You talking about that? That bridge is 14 feet wide, if I'm not mistaken. My wife just loved to drive a 12-foot swather through it. But I had a 14-foot John Deere disc, tandem disc, and we couldn't get it through there because you had to have somebody walk behind it and steer the thing, because there was just enough slack in the hooking it up that you could do this and get it through that bridge. And then Pages built that concrete crossing down there towards the Potter community, and then you could go that way if need be. Oh, and you're talking about the knife display? I have that case at home. Yeah. When Ernie was closing out his part of the store, there used to be a case that stood up just inside the door to the left under that big clock. And that had all kinds of wrenches displayed in it. My son Bob has that over at Ronan. And I have that other display case. When later on, when things got really fancy and we had engine-driven square balers and all that, New Holland made what they called a stacked cruiser. There's a self-propelled machine that would pick up these small square bales and put them in a package, and then you could set them down and pull away from them. Well, the engine went out of mine, so I went up to Robbie's dad's place and got this one that they had that they weren't using at the time. And I'm coming down and the thing wasn't running right. So I stopped at Tampico and we discovered that the governor's shaft, the bearings had worn into it so that it wasn't working properly. Ernie took it apart and he said, well, you better go to town and see if you can find a governor. Well, if the governor was made by the Cessna Company, and of course, there wasn't anything around that you could get one off of. Nobody had one in stock. I don't know how long it was gone, but I came back and I said, Ernie, I can't find anything. Oh, he said, just go over there and sit down. At the time, he had a little metal lathe. He'd taken this governor apart, taken the shaft, used Ron's rod, built the shaft up, stuck it in that lathe, turned it down, put new bearings on it, and put it back together. What do you think he charged me? $25. Just unreal. But that's, I guess, I came into the Tampico community, I wasn't born there, I was born up above the Cornwall Ranch headquarters. But my sister, who was born in '37, anyway, my dad leased this place it's right here and then on this side of the creek a little bit too, but from a fellow by the name of Fred Weigel. And we moved down there in 1945. My sister had to start school. Well, she didn't start school until she was 7. But she was the same age as Rick's older brother, Robert, and I think Larry Martin and Ronnie Martin. And so the teacher let my sister take first and second grade all at the same time and ticked those boys off because they didn't want to go. But, yeah. But an interesting, and then we moved there in 45, and then in 51, we moved way down here and bought the place that George White had started. We bought it from Roy Billingsley. He was a bachelor, and he had an old maid sister that lived there with him. And there's 500 cow ranch, machinery, workhorses, buildings, everything, $47,000. And I had it appraised in 2014, $3.8 million. And I called that guy here last fall, and I said, just by the way things have changed now, what do you think? He said, just double it. You know, and the sad thing is, if you're gonna sell that place to family members, you have to sell it at appraised value. I could sell it to you for whatever I wanted, but if I sell it to a family member, it has to be on appraised value, or I'm committing a crime, I guess. But anyway, like I said, George White filed a water right on Dry Run in 1895, so been irrigating for quite a while. And again, Lita, that's about all I've got.
All right.
Also, one of the things I maybe forgot to say was, my Uncle Mark was a politician, and I think there was some of the Cottons that were politicians. But they helped get that 5 miles from, I think, Paisley Crossing there paved, basically where Etchart and Page Whittam there. And I don't know if you guys remember that road, but I remember picking up my Grandma Etchart for church and that, and it could take half an hour to go out and half an hour back, and now you can go from Tampico to Glasgow in 10-12 minutes. So, but anyway, so hopefully you liked what we are trying to accomplish here was trying to put Tampico kind of back on the map, and to show that there's quite a bit of history, as you can just hear from the last hour and a half. And this project, when I first started it kind of morphed into a little bit more, and but I was very glad that it's being accepted into the Pioneer Museum. And when I checked a year ago, they really didn't have anything on Tampico, and I just thought, well, we need to put Tampico in the Pioneer Museum. So, would anybody else like to talk about Tampico? Sure, come on.
I don't think anybody
don't, has anybody mentioned that Richard had gas pumps there in front of the store too? And there was, as I remember, there was 2 gas pumps.
Yeah.
Well, as a young person coming into this community, Richard and Ernie were just so great when you went into the store and needed something, and so helpful, and never belittled you because you was a dumb woman. And yes, I remember Richard and his toothpick and the cigarettes. That was always a classic. But I just wanted to add that, and I'm glad you mentioned the sheep, because I can remember sheep coming down when I was first married, come down through Antelope Creek there, I guess.
Yeah,
So.
Yeah, Paul, the gas pumps that she mentioned, he had regular gasoline, the original pumps that were there, where the old one had a tank up on top.
Oh.
And you pump this lever, pump gas up there, and then it ran out into your vehicle. And then around the corner of the building, they had a green set up there that had a deal you could open up, and that was the white gas. And that was the same kind of a pump, only you just pumped it out, you didn't put it up here and let it run out. But, yeah, interesting stuff.
All right, would anybody else like to talk about Tampico, or we might wrap it up, or? Well, I'd like to thank you guys for coming. Hopefully you enjoyed the presentation and the speakers and everything, so. Yes, thank you.